Hello, and welcome to my talk. Thank you for coming. Today's talk is going to be about DMing the lizard brain, how to communicate through game visuals using shape design. So first things first, hello, I'm Alice. I'm Scout Ranger on everything. I've been a concept artist and art director for about 8 years, working in animation and games. I've worked at a bunch of local studios, including SMG, PlaySide, a little tiny bit of work at Summer4. But yeah, this is the sort of stuff that I usually work on that isn't NDA. This talk was actually inspired by a project that is still NDA, so this is all going to be work of my own, unfortunately. But yeah, also Bluey, I art directed on that. I also do some like edgy gamery stuff. All right, so this talk is fairly quick, but it goes over some shape design concept that I wish I'd learned years earlier. It took flying to Lightbox Expo in the States and sleeping on a concept artist's couch in Ohio for a month, but when it finally sunk in, for me it was like seeing The Matrix. It's basically just graphic design for artists though. So it turns out humans have pretty strong feelings about certain shapes. These two lines are just in a cartoon style, but they feel extremely different, right? Even if you haven't seen The Lion King, you know who the bad guy is. Color helps for sure. These two would work in grayscale, no problem, but the shape design of each of these characters is setting the audience up with a strong expectation of who these characters are. In fact, shapes are so strong to the human brain that you probably read these in different voices, right? This goes to show that shapes are far more emotionally impactful than even words or symbols. When I first started my concept art career, I was obsessed with symbols and authenticity. I would research endlessly and deep dive Wikipedia, thinking that accuracy would make better art. While this helped to lend flavor, trivia, and subject knowledge could only speak to the intellectual part of the viewer and had no sway on the older, more primitive part of the brain that actually felt things, the lizard brain. So here's a weird question. How does Piglet make you feel? Does anyone want to volunteer an answer?
Like telling my child no.
I mean, he's pretty cute and harmless, right? What about now? Yeah, Peter Young is an absolute boss at this stuff. He works in the games industry too, so check him out. But yeah, you feel extremely different about the shapes in Piglet now. So for this one, I need you to get your art QA hats on. Here are some assets for a new project, but one doesn't belong. Which asset doesn't belong in the art style?
The giant penis.
Yeah, the middle tree. You can probably detect the pattern. Today's talk, or the name of today's talk might give it away, but that pine tree is pretty out of place. Regardless of if it was intended or not, the player is being told two things. Number one, this tree is kind of dangerous. And number two, this tree is kind of exceptional or special, mechanically or narratively. It's breaking a pattern of round, thick shapes and establishing a shape identity all for itself. It must be important, right? Now, it might be, it might not be, but in this case, we probably didn't want a devious pine tree in our cute little world. As a dev, if you're not aware of this kind of thing, it can work its way into your game's artwork and feed the player information that is confusing. Is the pine tree special? Is it an evil pine tree, or is it just a pine tree? Not only that, but it starts to wreck the consistent look of our game. So this thing can happen for a bunch of reasons, having multiple artists on a team, using store-bought assets, or just ignorance to the effect that shapes have on humans. So the good news is that we can harness this innate response to shapes and use it for our own bidding. And the benefits of doing this are threefold. We can talk directly to the lizard brain, which is more emotive and effective than text, as you just saw. We can utilize artwork for information in the game rather than just being pretty pictures. And that can be for the story in the game, or it can be gameplay, or it can be both. And it's also an opportunity for a strong visual identity. Using shape design, we can talk to that ancient, more emotive part of the brain. So how do we do that exactly? The first thing to know is each one of these aspects is a channel to deliver information to your player. The gestalt principles vary from source to source, but this is my own personal list. It's kind of a fun thing to think about. You'll see some people use like closure. I don't think that's part of it. Let's tweet about it. We'll dive into this shortly, but each has unique associations to the viewer, which can be leveraged when you make patterns. Even just looking at this, you might characterize each of these and feel like maybe one square is left out, or one square is a little bit different. It's important to know that psychologically, some of these avenues are able to be interpreted a little bit faster in the brain than others. So colours work faster than shapes, which is why things tend to get colour-coded in team sports or bullet hells. But yeah, for today, we're just going to focus on these four, mostly scale and shape type. So scale, we've got big, medium, small. Shape type, triangle, circle, square. Dimensions, thick versus thin. Symmetry, perfect versus imperfect. And symmetry is extra imperfect because it's in lowercase. Oh, yeah. That's what I want. So the first aspect that humans really tend to respond to is scale. Here, we've got two types of crab. You probably would not have the same emotional response if you saw one of these in your backyard. Humans have a bias towards the big. Big means important. Big can be pretty scary. Game design already has a bit of a trope for this. Big boss, big key, big stats. A lot of shooters use this, including Valorant, Overwatch, and TF2. They use scale really effectively to tell you what a threat is. So tanks, they're huge. Pokemon does this too. So the starter Pokemon get bigger as they evolve. It's giving feedback to your lizard brain that they're now more powerful. It's blunt and it's effective. But what about some nuance? So the tool to remember here is big, medium, and small. This will force you to prioritize the most important elements of your design. If something is meant to be impactful emotionally or is important to the gameplay, make it big. Ask yourself, what elements are weakest or least important that can allow for the important aspects to shine? A great example of this nuanced design is in TF2. So TF2 has each body part be proportional to its significance in the game, creating a design that's kind of rich in gameplay information. For starters, all the TF2 characters sacrifice head size for more body real estate, which is important for reading a character's movements and orientation in an action shooter. These characters have personalities, but it is second to the mechanical gameplay experience. So if we take the heavy over on the right-hand side, the priorities for this character, you can probably tell already, are number 1, big gun, number 2, spongy body, and number 3, he's not very fast. That's basically the classic formula for a tank. If you look carefully, his arms are even bigger than his legs, suggesting that he can punch harder than he can run. The Scout, by contrast, is like a character of high speed, low health, and low power. The body proportions reflect this as well. His legs are the biggest part of him, while his gun is tiny. For these characters, the heavy in particular, designers didn't really have to rely too much on cultural symbols of toughness, like cool sunglasses or helmets or plate armor. The proportions do this job and make it intuitive. if your game is narrative focused, you may want to dedicate more of your character's real estate to face size. If your game doesn't require the use of certain limbs, like hands in a platformer, you might opt to eliminate them completely, which can save development time and lead to an interesting character. For example, Crash Bandicoot, he doesn't have a neck. And this goes all the way down. It's really cool. So if you take a look at their faces and you think jaws symbolize toughness or neck width symbolizes toughness, you can see where the priorities are for the heavy and where they are for the medic. The medic has a massive forehead, and it's even getting wider at the top. The medic is definitely more brains than brawn, and the heavy is more brawn than brains. And the shapes reflect that. The other part is having the mass of the heavy's face really low projects a sense of stability, where weight carried high tends to feel more powerful. The medic is a slightly crazed scientist, so the subtle flare on his forehead works with that idea. Neocortex from Crash Bandicoot does that as well. So yeah, weight distribution. This same thing works on props, environments, whatever you want. Again, the visual weight projects a real sense of stability when it's down low. Up high, it looks kind of powerful. All right, scale in the environment. So the relationship or proportion of the scale of the player matters a ton for emotional impact. If you imagine you're the blue square over here and the environment around you looks like this, it's a little bit boring. There's no power structure. The scale isn't being used to say anything. This channel is kind of just being put on mute. When the player is oversized, you have a real sense of safety or power over the environment, which could be used for a feeling of mastery. What about if the player is made to feel small against their environment? This could be the start of a horror game. Or maybe the player is entering a hallowed ground. So player versus environment is all well and good, but there is one third aspect here, the camera. If we refocus the camera, the player and their expressions become more important and powerful as they're taking up a greater proportion of the frame. Camera choice is both artistic and functional in games, and need not be static. All right, so onto the real fun stuff. I don't know how much of you have heard of this one before. Could I just get a raise of hands if you've heard this? Oh, cool. There's loads of people who haven't heard it. So yeah, this is a really, really important one when it comes to graphic design and concept art. So there are 3 primary types of shape: triangle, square, and circle. And each has its own emotional response. And this also applies to their 3D counterparts, like a pyramid or a cube. We're just simplifying here. So triangles, or tapering shapes, or even just diagonals, tend to feel really active and dangerous. Squares, with cubes and straight lines, tend to feel really sturdy and strong. Circles, or even just beveled edges, tend to lead to a feeling that's friendly, safe, or even sacred or religious. So when you use these shapes in your character and prop designs, it's an excellent way to set up expectations and an understanding of who your character is from a glance. Once you see this kind of thing in media, it's really, really hard to unsee it. It doesn't matter if your design is as simple as a ring or as complicated as a Marvel movie costume. Tweaking the shapes in your character or prop is going to elicit a strong emotional response. There is a reason that Simba wasn't designed with cat-like sharp eyes that Scar has, even though that might be more accurate to a real-life lion. Realism just isn't important. Lizard brain speaks in shorthand, so you have to speak back in the same way. Shapes can also be used for creating incorrect expectations. So we've got a whole lot of rounded characters here, and we've got one really tough character, and this can surprise or create humour. All right, back to games context. How do we know who's harmful? Same game, same art style, both mushrooms. How do we know who's good and bad?
Thanks.
Eyebrows. It's a shape hierarchy. I mean, the eyebrows help and the fangs help. But a Goomba is like 80% triangle and 20% rounded. And like most of the world in Mario is rounded anyway, so what does that count for? It's not about what the object is or what color it is in Mario, or even what a mushroom symbolizes. It's just about shapes. And the franchise didn't do this at the start. In fact, the original Super Mushroom was triangular and basically the same shape as a Goomba. I think here, in pursuit of having a cohesive theme, the unique identity and shape has gotten a little bit forgotten, and the player has to be taught what is dangerous, good, and inert, rather than intuit it from the artwork. So the original Super Mario is often held up as a masterclass in teaching player mechanics in a natural way. But given a power-up could be shaped like anything, what if the artwork could have done this job instead? Well, good news, they do now. When we compare gameplay objects to gameplay objects in Mario, the shapes of each character give us an emotional response, circle, triangle, square, and it reflects how things will impact your gameplay. Of course, the little angry faces present on Mario characters can be used to indicate friendliness, or fangs, and humans have an innate bias to be interested in faces. However, if you decide that faces are going to be the defining factor to deliver gameplay information, this would be a trade-off. You wouldn't have characters that could emote, which would strip all the charm and humour out of the game. I just love those moments when Goombas have thoughts and they think and they walk around, or they get angry, or, pleased with themselves. Instead, Mario in modern times has practically made this into a science. So many platformers use spikes as a shorthand for inaccessible or deadly zones, but Mario places enemies on this spectrum as well. The more dangerous a character is, the more triangles feature as a proportion of their design. The more beneficial a character is, the rounder they become. And the more like terrain, the squarer they become. The thwomp is a really neat example. It's intuitive because you can stand on the squarer version. It's important to note here that almost no objects occupy the middle of this shape design alignment chart and use all three shapes. The middle space is kind of reserved for a more nuanced character like a boss or Princess Peach. For this game, clarity of mechanics is 10 times more important than story nuance. So most characters occupy 2 dimensions only. A question again. Who's more trustworthy?
Triangle.
Bingo. I mean, I can't argue with your feelings, but I'm glad. Yeah, I guessed it. So this guy, right? He has a spiny outside, but his intentions are good. There's a great book by John Klassen that basically does this. He's the guy that did the book Who Stole My Hat? It's amazing. It's great graphic design. But yeah, Triangle is our friendly guy. He might have a spiny outside, but his intentions are good. It's kind of like a wolf in sheep's clothing or an expression on a face. We look to the center of a design to see its true intent. So this leads me to inside versus outside shape. You can have contrast and hierarchy here. So an excellent example of this in practice is Mike and Sully. So Sully is mostly a tough guy who's a softie at heart, and his shapes tell you that. He's a tough guy on the outside and round on the inside. Mike is friendly and ineffectual at scaring, but he's also a wise guy. So this gets even more complicated. When you compare the leads to the cast, the level of complexity is really, really well managed. So Mike and Sully have a really nice conflict in their shapes. They've got different shapes on the outside than the inside. And this makes them stand out against a backdrop of very simple and round characters. There's a couple of spikes in there just to remind you that they're monsters, but most of these characters are really just soft. This is definitely a if everybody's super, no one is situation. So it really is an art to control your NPCs and make sure that your leads are standing out against a possibly noisy background. And this isn't limited to cartoon characters either. You can do the same thing with modern clothing or superhero designs. So Marvel's costume designers have made deliberate choices in how to depict their characters. Just like Sully, Thor is kind of the same shape language. He's a big, tough guy with a heart of gold. His cape essentially makes his first read a brick if his hammer wasn't enough of a clue. The panels of his braces and greaves are really thick and square, and the chainmail all over his body isn't typical Lord of the Rings chainmail, it's just squares. Loki, however, is the foil to Thor, and he's a trickster who wants to take over the world. His shapes have a hierarchy with triangles on top, but he's also got a ton of thin and asymmetrical shapes, which leads me to my next element. Dimensions of characters count for a lot too. Thinness can add a sense of elegance, speed, or contribute to a strong creep-out message to your lizard brain with memories of insects, fragility, or sickness. To the lizard brain, thick is generally safe and sturdy, but it can also mean slow. And this isn't just a feature of Loki's design. A load of games use this as well, especially when it's difficult or impossible to use certain types of shape, like in a voxel or a pixel style. GLaDOS definitely wouldn't have the same impact if she had a nice chunky case for her robot arm. Minecraft is also pretty limited in what it can do for shapes, but Endermen make a really solid and effective use of dimensions, possibly even more scary than a creeper. Going back to our Marvel boys, symmetry tends to give a feeling of order, reliability, human intervention, or even godliness, but it can also be kind of boring. Asymmetry tends to portray organicness or chaos, or tends to give a sense of a nuanced object or character, as it usually takes an event for something to be asymmetrical. Again, this can be used at multiple levels, in a character's face, in their body, in the world, in props. It's all about contrast. All right, back to the grey box RPG. How does this work when we're balancing three aspects: the environment, the player, and an object? Imagine you are the player, the blue square. Would you move towards this item? Does it feel safe? No. Oh. Oh, my next line seems like a no-brainer, but using the Mario school of circle equals good, this is bare bones and straightforward shape design. What about now? Based on the squareness of the world, this might mean that something is harmful, but it is also quite possible for it to be interpreted as something active, maybe a power-up. Going by the patterns of Mario, it would definitely be dangerous. All right, so contrasting a pattern. Let's change the world to something a little bit more rounded. Does it feel more or less dangerous to pick up this item? Good. I was going out on a limb here with a lot of these. I'm like, I hope I know what I'm talking about. But yeah, note how the triangle starts to feel like it's broken out of our art style, like it's from another world, like in the first example with the pine tree. It breaks the pattern by being both a triangle in a world of squares and by being the only shape not to have rounded corners. But this can be used in the right way. Abzu is an absolutely amazing game that made me cry just rewatching the trailer, so I really encourage you to go and play that. And it uses really, really strong shape contrast for a narrative purpose. In the beautiful world of Abzu, fish, seaweed, rocks, blobs of coral, and the shapes of light on the water surface are rounded with irregular edges, and this forms the base pattern of the game. The player then travels to an underwater civilization with hard geometrical forms that comes across as utterly alien and sparks a strong emotional response without the utterance of a single word. I don't want to reveal too much, but the impact would be absolutely nowhere near the same if the triangular mines at the end were rounded to match the initial art style. Dissonance can be used on purpose. So what if we just match it to the art style? It's now more congruent with the style of the world. It still looks a little dangerous. It still keeps its identity, but it ultimately looks like it belongs. Very cute. This is more in line with the consistency of a game like Animal Crossing. There aren't emotional highs and lows, but each object is allowed to have an identity. Association can be a really powerful way of using shapes as well. Even though our player and our object are now triangles in a world of rounded forms, what does this say about our player in comparison to the world they live in? Do they fit in? Now the black triangle kind of looks like a child, or maybe an extended limb, or a projectile, or something that's at least good for or related to the blue triangle. Despite the triangle's initial association with danger, or coolness, the context of association is beginning to sculpt its meaning and influence how we interact with this game. We have created a motif. So shape motifs can be powerful to unify the way a group of people or a culture or a game looks. In Zelda, the shape design of the Zora as a whole is 80% triangle, 20% square. As a huge group, they are prickly but good. The Gerudo shape language is 80% circle and 20% triangle, matriarchal but a warrior. The citizens of each culture have the same shapes as their weapons and environment. Gerudo or Zora NPCs are not individually important, so they do not receive their own unique shape language or motif. Essentially, each culture is treated as one character, and the shapes are prioritized again and again. The drawback of this is that unification trades off the nuance of individuals, but it does create a strong unifying and stylistic effect. Lord of the Rings does this exact same thing. So all the elves are tall and curved, dwarves are square and short, hobbits are round. Their cultural works, their biome, their character designs are all aligned. They all look like where they come from. The information is simplified to the essentials as not to take away from the major characters who receive more detail and slightly more nuanced proportions in their shapes and designs. Shapes can also be used for total art style cohesion. This approach can be seen in games like Valorant or Don't Starve, where everything is sharp. Almost none of the shapes have their own identity, and when they do, they stand out. Or even Bluey. Bluey literally just makes everything into a rounded square. That was my whole job. I also drew that background. Woo. But yeah, by using the same shape type for all the elements in the game, I'm essentially freezing this channel of communication for individual elements. I wonder now, does this black triangle look good to pick up? Yes, still, even though it's a triangle? I think the dimensions of the world around it have made it look downright friendly. On the other hand, if I wanted to have a spike pit or communicate extra danger in this game, that would be pretty difficult. I might have to use another avenue, like colour or scale, or even teach the player what's dangerous and what to avoid. A major positive of this pattern is that there is no dissonance in shape type. I'm declaring a consistent mood. Everything is triangles. Everything is active or scary, which could be great and really visually interesting with just a little bit of colour. I think this is the reason a lot of indies opt for pixel or voxel art. By having everything be one shape, a square, it absolves the artist of the powerful but potentially kind of messy channel of shape type in a design. To start summing up, it's really important that you prioritise what gameplay information is most important and by what channel it is going to be communicated. Again, going back to Mario, because they're just so good, distinguishing platforms and then good and bad characters is top priority. But this doesn't have to be done by shapes. Nintendo could have alternately chosen a colour scheme for its enemies, or created enemies that were so intricate and so unique in shape that they are recognisable to the player. This is basically what Overwatch does. It depends on the priorities of your game and what aspects you want to leave free to inject artistry and novelty. Shapes, scale, dimensions, it's all just part of the tools you can use for your visual communication. Mario also saves colour, it saves its colour for novelty, and so you get the unique flavour of that game. It's a unique trade-off. But yeah, in summary, comparison creates the narrative. You want to ask yourself who is stronger, who is kinder, what is the most important. Start with extremes and probably fill in the gaps. Ask yourself which elements of your design are currently equal or the same, and should they be? It's worth thinking of all the things that you can compare or draw contrast with in your game. Body part versus body part, face versus face, character versus environment, culture versus culture. Consider, strong hierarchy creates clarity, weak hierarchy creates nuance. So 80-20 for strong style, mood and clarity, 60-30-10 for nuance. No hierarchy creates confusion, so avoid that. Even NPCs have a culture. And the way I like to design things is design with the shape hierarchy in mind first, and then start adding, symbols and objects and pieces of clothing that fit that. All right, I told you this was a quick talk. Just to sum up, I want to shout out some absolutely amazing books. I'll just sing their praises for a second because I've got some time. Picture This was a huge inspiration for this talk. If you've read it, you will have seen that. It is relatively unknown, but it's about making picture books. It's short and it's illuminating. Design of Everyday Things is a classic. Puts into words things you've felt your entire life. It's a must-read if you touch UI at all. Vision is about filmic framing, just really good on the film side of things, and Universal Principles, which gives really good insight into the human response to base elements. Just the tools one more time. And yeah, thank you. This was a really speedy one, but if you have questions, we've got time for that, or if you want to head out, that's cool too. Yes. Once the mic arrives to whoever, sorry.
What is your favorite combination of shapes and scale and stuff?
You could probably see in the personal work that I do, I started out as a concept artist thinking that I had to do really edgy gamer stuff, or I had to, draw like Blizzard artists. when we get there. But yeah, I love just doing cute stuff. So yeah, like circle, square.
You mentioned how people notice colour before shape. Is there a further hierarchy, like scale being clearer than form or anything like that?
There probably is, and that's probably a really interesting thing to investigate. I know animation is definitely up there. It usually comes from stuff that humans had to notice to survive. Like we developed colour vision first, just like dark and light, and then, movement. So shapes probably comes after that, but it does make a pretty big impact.
You talked about how triangles can convey both danger but also like activity and like power.
Yeah.
So for example, with like the Mario star is quite spiky, but it's not dangerous. So how do you go about differentiating between those two?
I think there are some some symbols that exist in like cultural knowledge that are good. Like people generally think stars are pretty good. But if you look at the Mario star, they don't indulge the sharpness of it at all. They like chunk it up and make it chubby and give it eyes and like avoid that connotation as much as possible. So you can have like objects that, maybe you have to have your character has a staff, but they're supposed to be a really cute character. There are ways that you can kind of work in opposition to say like, hey, this character has a really sharp thing, but I promise they're cute. They're actually really cute. Just like chucks so many circles on it, bevel the hell out of it.
Okay.
In one of the previous questions, you mentioned animation, and I'm wondering, is there any sort of tenets to animation that can extend this sort of shapes principle, specifically in motion, to convey these ideas?
Well, I did animation as my degree, but I've probably come up blank on that one because it's been so long, and I think someone who does animation would probably be able to speak a little bit more to that one.
Hello. Which one is more affect of the mood of the characters? Is it the shape or colors for you?
I would say colour is probably the number one in setting a mood. And you have a pretty immediate response to it. But yeah, I feel like shapes are the ignored channel of art, so I'm here to barrack for them. And like if you use both together at once, just like in that Abzu example, oh my God, it brings tears to your eyes. Yeah.
I'm not sure if you probably have seen Into the Spider-Verse. So you mentioned before that, squares and circles generally have friendly connotations, which is why I can't quite figure out how they made Kingpin seem so threatening, given that his silhouette is basically just a square and a circle.
Oh, interesting. I wish I could bring that up, but I think there's a few things going on there. They've made his head really small, so it kind of implies that like his emotions and his face are not important to this character. It's like his body and his mass and his presence. Other things is like his arms are really spiny and spiky and weedy. And I think he's pretty top heavy, right? Yeah. So you can contradict some of this in interesting ways and make interesting combinations.
Excellent, thank you.
Hello. Is there use in making characters that are more towards the center of the scale between shapes, if you know that you're, say, going to change them later on? So, like, if you made Thor basically in the center of all the shapes, and you knew you were going to change them based on later information.
Just for reference, I haven't seen any of the Avengers movies, I'm sorry. I can speak to my impression of the shapes, but Yeah, you can definitely set up that kind of thing. You can say, like, if he suddenly turns bad, maybe you give him a big slash through the middle of his costume that kind of forms like a triangular shape. Or maybe you give him some asymmetry through damage, or maybe you give him a new hat. That's a really, like, Band-Aid solution.
So like an NPC becoming more important as they gain more shape.
Yeah, like detail is another thing that I didn't really speak to because I feel like it's pretty obvious. Like either you have a lot of detail in the background or you have a lot of detail in your main cast. But yeah, there are ways and creative ways to change a character's design halfway through if they like suddenly turn good or suddenly turn bad. I think Loki's design actually throughout the Marvel movies, as he gets a bit more nice, I think, it tends to get a little bit thicker, a little bit rounder. I might be wrong with that one.
Oh, thank you.
No worries.
Hi, Alice. Thank you for that talk. I do have a question by my daughter will kill me if I don't say thank you for Bluey. She absolutely adores that show. So thank you very much.
Oh, it was my pleasure to work on it.
And I obviously enjoy it as well. But my question is, like, for you personally, what's your design process in terms of, like, basically just designing characters and environments? Like, where do you begin and how do you kind of, like, develop it further into a final kind of, like, thing?
Yep. Okay, I think I look at the context of where the character's going to go first. Or if I'm, like, just starting out designing the characters or get a prompt, I'll look at the really key aspects of like who the character is. Are they generally good? Are they generally bad? Or is it more nuanced? Do they have to have like a more even shape ratio in them? And I'll just pick one because the worst thing you can do is give things even amounts. Like if you give equal scale to everything, you create like a ladder and it just becomes a really boring character. But yeah, I would just look at the context, say like if it's a really cute game, you probably don't have to do that much to make a character look menacing. But if it is like a very, very triangular game, maybe you think like, oh, okay, I'm going to have to start using color here, or I'm going to have to start, I don't know, using symbols that the player will know are evil. So I'll give him some cool sunglasses or something. Yeah, but context is king. And you also want to think about like, is this the most evil guy in the universe? Is he the absolute extreme of this art style? Or is he just kind of on the scale of like, henchman? If that's it, you guys can go. Free lunch.